This is Can You Believe It? Where we believe that all truth is God's truth, whether that truth is found in nature, in the sciences, in philosophy, or in mathematics. All truth is God's truth, and our responsibility is to dig it out and to share it with the rest of humanity. We've been looking at the issue of race and asking the question, how did we get here? And we've gone deeper into the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, and the 19th centuries, looking at the foundational myths that governed or drove this myth of racism. Today, I want us to look at the 18th century, and we will notice that by the end of the 18th century, the controversy about slavery and the place of the Negro or the Black person continued to heat up. A gentleman by the name of Charles White lived from 1728 to 1813, an English physician focused on the question of whether Black Africans were products of the same act of creation as whites, in an account of the regular gradation of man published in 1799. So Charles White proposed that Black Africans were inferior both physically and intellectually, and were an intermediate form between true humans and animals. In the early 1800s, Europe and America, there was a revival of the pre-Adamite theory, which we looked at a little bit earlier. And many scholars and scientists and anthropologists attempted to reconcile this fact or this myth with the Bible. The 19th century version of the pre-Adamite theory was developed by an American by the name of Dr. Samuel Morton, an accomplished electric physician and paleontologist. Morton is known for his technique of measuring the cranial capacity of human skulls by filling them with pepper seeds and then making a judgment on which skull has a deeper or capacity to accommodate more intelligence. That's the science from the 19th century by a gentleman by the name of Dr. Samuel Morton. Morton and his disciples of the American School of Anthropology by the name of George Glendon, and there was another gentleman by the name of Josiah Nott and Louis Agassiz. Louis Agassiz is going to be very influential here in a minute. But this gentleman reformulated and resurrected a powerful case of pre-adamism. Basically, there was a creation of another race of humans prior to the creation of Adam and Eve, trying to reconcile this myth with biblical accounts. And Morton's and his disciples' arguments went as follows: that the cranial sizes and the characteristics of various human racial groups were fixed and remained the same throughout recorded history. The fixed cranial traits included a progressive decrease in cranial capacity from whites to Asians and to Native Americans and to Blacks. So these fixed differences do not fit any biblical chronology at all. Nobody expected to, right? But the best explanation was to imagine a separate creation account of the different types of mankind. So Morton, like his followers or predecessors for that matter, strongly professed the inferiority of the other races over white Europeans. So when Morton comes to die in about 1851, in his obituary, which was printed in Charleston, all right, medical journal, this is what his obituary read. Is this it's the fact of the matter? I'm just presenting the facts and the history. Quote, for that matter, from the obituary of Charles Morton, or rather of Morton here. We of the South should consider him as our benefactor for aiding most materially in giving to the Negro his true position as an inferior race. We believe the time is not far distant when it will be universally admitted that neither can the leopard change his spots, nor the Ethiopian his skin. End of quote. Notice that one of that piece of that quote is actually from the scriptures. All right. So that's printed in the obituary of Morton in 1851. And again, he's believing that, different races, different skin tones have different brain capacities, right? So after Morton's death in 1851, came a gentleman by the name of Josiah Nott. And Josiah Nott was born in 1804 to 1873. Nott became the main spokesman, all right, for the American School of Anthropology. So this issue, this myth is moving on from just an Inquisition proposal, a myth about ways of taking stuff that doesn't belong to you, is going on to philosophy, is going on to the sciences, going on to anthropology, and to now the medical world. It's involving the creation and rather, or the shape of the brains and the size of brains now. All right. So after Morton's death, we have Josiah Nott becoming the main spokesman of the American School of Anthropology. And Nott's writings on race were colored by pure arrogant, racist, or racial prejudice. For instance, Nott claimed that he was separating the actual history of mankind from the biblical account by showing that the Bible dealt with the creation and the development of the Adamites, the Caucasians for that matter, and not with that of the pre-Adamites and the rest of mankind. Man, you can't make this stuff up. No, this is quite interesting. So, however, another scholar of the day by the name of Louis Agassiz, I told you his name will come up here, who lived from 1807 to 1873, just a few years before my grandfather was born. Here, Agassiz added international scientific credits and respectability to this group called the pre-Adamites. Agassiz, who was the son of a Protestant minister in French Switzerland. Go figure that one out too. Son of a Protestant minister, right? He's using the Bible to develop a theory that before God created Adam and Eve, there were some other people who are really not humans, who are called the pre-Adamites. They were there before Adam and Eve, okay? Son of a pastor. So soon after his arrival in the Americas, Agassiz visited, of course, his model by the name of Morton. He visited Morton, and who was living in Philadelphia by then. And Agassiz developed, or rather, delivered his first American lectures in Boston, in Massachusetts, in 1846, not long ago again. And he was very successful in his convictions of this pre-Adamite theory and used the Bible to support it. And as a result, he was offered a position to teach at, guess what? Guess where he was teaching? Harvard University, of all places. a position which he accepted with joy, to be a professor of zoology at Harvard. Well, this myth is becoming serious. It's now being incorporated in the academic world of some of the most prestigious schools. Maybe Harvard may not have been that prestigious to begin with, but now it's being taught. It is now moving from the educated elites in biology, anthropology, paleontology, and science to their classroom programs. All right. It will now be taught at the most prestigious schools of the day. And the first school to embrace the myth of race is none other than Harvard University in Boston, of all schools. Now, remember, Harvard was founded in 1636 by the Massachusetts Bay Colony as a college to educate the clergy. See this big twist here? The school was named Harvard College in 1639 after John Harvard, the school's first benefactor, who left his estate and his library to the school upon his death. Guess what? 200 years later, after the school was founded to train pastors in the clergy, it moved to the far left, and I don't know whether it was to the far left, but in 1846, it began to teach a myth about origins. So Agassiz, who was the student of Morton, believed that all humans were created differently with different talents. People of color had a different but inferior talent to those of whites. And just like Hume and Immanuel Kant before him proposed and believed, Agassiz based his theory on the supposition that African had never created a civilization. The African people had never created a civilization. Well, I don't think he had visited Africa, by the way. Agassiz believed that the Africans had never developed any regulated societies and that, had always been slaves, and therefore, because of that history, they should remain so. Can you believe it? That is Agassiz. They should remain as slaves. Agassiz believed that because of this history, it was a waste of time and effort to give the Africans the education and the cultural benefits of European civilization. Just keep them oppressed. Now, he's teaching at Harvard University. Harvard may not have been as popular as it is today, but we see a transition of, should I say, fake news making it to the front lines as real facts, or presented as real facts. The myth of race was taking a new form, a new shape amongst the educated elites. Agassiz, who was a student of Morton at the American School of Anthropology, argued in 1846 that God had created whites and blacks as separate species. Human races have different origins, and in fact, humans were different species altogether. He, like Immanuel Kant, argued that the mixing between the races could only lead to the inferior people gaining popularity and becoming more like the superior people, both biologically and intellectually. So this reasoning will be carried forth by prominent politicians and scientists, as we shall see its manifestation in the American South in the early 1900s to the 1960s. The mixing of races was highly discouraged. In fact, it wasn't until maybe the late 1980s that we start seeing a mixing between races. And now it's like the in thing. So Agassiz argued that the whites were superior to other races and were the only truly civilized race, and that the mixture of whites with other races was causing a deterioration of civilization and were becoming a danger to the future. It was therefore necessary to keep the races separate, and as a result of Agassiz's thinking, there was no reason to afford people of color any education or any other benefits of civilization for that matter. Imagine growing up in that kind of a worldview and with that social pressure. Can you start to feel the pain of the African Americans growing up in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s and 50s, living in America or in Europe during this time? Well, while the American School of Anthropology was influenced by people like Morton, Nott, Galton, and Agassiz, racist theories were also beginning to brew up in Europe. The most influential European biological determinist by then was a Frenchman by the name of Joseph Arthur Comte de Gibbonneau, who lived in 1816 through 1882. Joseph Comte, he had bought into the myth of race and believed that there existed a noble class of Europeans, people who were thought to be more noble than others. In his argument, the claim of superiority had shifted from being theologically based to being a more dependent on biological qualities. All right. So let's leave the Bible aside and the theologies aside. Let's look into the biology and see if we're going to see any differences. That's what Comte argues. Even though these qualities were seen to be divinely endowed by most of the Franks and the Anglo-Saxons, the Nordics and the Alpines and the Mediterraneans, the lighter skinned, if you are tall, you are blonde, you are Nordic, you are assumed to be the descendants of ancient Germanic tribes, the originators of all true civilization, and the only people capable of, listen to this, leadership. So it was Comte who first used the word Aryan after it was coined by a British colonial administrator to demonstrate or to designate the common ancestral language. And so in 1819, the term Aryan or Aryanism began to gain widespread authority due to the lectures and writings of Friedrich Schlegel, a German poet and scholar. So Comte proclaimed that the success of civilization was directly dependent upon the purity of Aryan blood within it. According to Comte, the Aryans were seen to be the founders of true human civilization. Comte Gibbonneau believed that the white races, and especially the Aryans for that matter, would remain in command only if they could eliminate the danger of interbreeding with the immorally and, should I say, intellectually inferior people, amongst them the Black peoples. I'm only giving you the history here. So this notion of racial purity and the dangers of interbreeding became extremely popular in the US South in the 1850s. Now, listen to the trajectory of Comte's thinking in the next phase. For in 1876, Gibbonneau Comte met with German musician by the name of Richard Wagner. That name was mentioned before in a past episode, but by now you know Richard Wagner even better. You will know him. He's also going to be a friend of one of the most evil people that ever existed in this world, none other than Hitler. So Richard Wagner is a new name here, and I have met quite a number of young university students, and the first name they want to throw at me is Friedrich Nietzsche, as a reason to why they think God does not exist, and all the other reasons that have really no backbone or biblical or logical support. So here comes Richard Wagner, who is going to be impressed by the writings of Comte, and so are the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche also influencing Richard Wagner as well. So Richard Wagner and Nietzsche are embracing this Aryan concept of greatness and the racial superiority amongst the elites of the day. You see how this is going to develop into a big evil thing. Now, take note that Wagner, who was Adolf Hitler's friend, and it was indeed Richard Wagner who set the foundation for anti-Semitism, if I may say so, between the 1848 and 1850. Wagner evoked this image of the Jew as being the agent of corruption and not to be trusted. So, but the sad news is that just before the turn of the 20th century, many of Comte's views were introduced to German readers by a gentleman by the name of Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who lived from 1855 through 1927. Now, Germany in 1927, try to think what kind of a state that was. So Chamberlain was highly influenced by the philosophy of Immanuel Kant as well, and wrote 2 volumes on Immanuel Kant's work. So this philosophy and the teachings that are preceding the 1900s is going to create a lot of havoc for the rest of humanity. So Chamberlain claimed that the Jews had an inherent moral defective characteristic, and his anti-Semitic song became a core principle of Nazi philosophy. I think it's only right we mention another scholar by the name of Ernest Haeckel. Ernest Haeckel, living in 1854 through 1919, we're now moving to the 1900s, who was a respected scientist of his time and a strong believer in Darwinism. Haeckel believed that the living non-white races provided links documenting the evolution of humans from apes to the more advanced Europeans. Did you catch that? A respected scientist of the day. So Ernest Haeckel believed that the dilution of German blood by inferior types was causing the degeneration of the Aryan race. Why did I hear that? Haeckel therefore called for putting a stop to the immigration of Jews and to assign a totally different value to their lives. From a myth to the point of now destroying life. Oh, what wretched men we are. So Haeckel pointed out the story of ancient Sparta, where the weak and the sickly or those affected with bodily infirmity were eliminated, and the perfect healthy were allowed to live and propagate their race. Soon you're going to hear another name by the name of, we're going to bring into another name on also the eugenics is coming up pretty soon after this. This is the 1900s, all right? So we're going to bring a name by the name of Morton again in a minute here, and it's not going to be looking good. So see where this is going. We are talking about 1920s in Germany. The lie was beginning to spread, and the seed of hatred for the Red Indians, for the blacks and the Jews had been sown and watered by the elites in the fields of science, anthropology, paleontology, zoology, and philosophy. A myth that started with greed, taking land that did not belong to them. A lie that had no theological, no biological, no scientific backing at all. But it's going to change the trajectory of events in world history. So the German people saw Haeckel as a messiah of national and racial regeneration amongst themselves. His book, which was titled The Riddle of the Universe, had sold over 500,000 by the end of World War II. So until 1900s, the environment was seen as a factor that could have an impact to influence on certain morphological and behavioral traits of humans. But in Western Europe and in the United States, the abandonment of the belief in acquired characteristics was the stimulus for the beginning of the another evil period, the beginning of eugenics as a movement, another sad period of the human history, by showing that the environment could not change human behavior based on race or biology. They keep on developing. Let's find something that's going to make people believe, something that's going to have a backbone. So let's move to eugenics. So Darwinism and the new science in genetics gave racism a scientific basis, for it had lacked that backbone for so long. So in 1889, an embryologist by the name of Agassiz Weismann put Lamarck's idea on the inheritance of acquired characteristics to rest as an explanation for the evolutionary change in biological characteristics. We looked at Lamarck's theory. He showed that no matter what change occurred in the body or the behavior of an animal, these changes did not appear in the offspring. So this is now an embryologist. He has authority, embryos. So before the development of a human being, name is August Weismann, and he's putting to rest the idea of Lamarckism, and bringing up something new, the science of eugenics here now. So Weismann argued that the differences between the varieties of humans could be explained on only biological mechanics, that it is by heredity only. Okay, so here the embryo's text command. So the rediscovery of genetics and Darwin theory of natural selection, therefore, gave the new science enthusiasts a reason to hold on to a new form of myth that was strongly supported by these biological determinists. At the same time, a new proponent of eugenics by the name of Hamish Schaller emerged on the scene. And Hamish Schaller studied at Harvard University, and in 1864, Schaller was appointed assistant in paleontology at Harvard Museum of Paleontology by none other than Agassiz. So Schaller taught over 7,000 students at Harvard and believed that the Americas and Africa and Australia had shown by their human products that they were unfitted to be the cradle places of great people. Schaller taught that these continents have never from their own blood built a race that are risen above barbarianism, basically borrowing from Kant and from the philosophy of the past. And Hume, of course, David Hume, all right? So Schaller, of course, was opposed to the mixing of various species of humans, right? Schaller shaped a great number of graduates from Harvard, including powerful anti-immigration politicians by the name of Henry Cabot Lodge. Who doesn't know that guy? Henry Cabot Lodge, and our very own President Theodore Roosevelt. It was this science of biological determinism, that racial prejudice, and the belief in a myth, and the active agenda of eugenics, which is the separation and the breeding of a special class of people, and strict biological determinism that formed the backbone of the rise of Nazism in Germany. Social Darwinism became very popular in the late Victorian era in England as well, and in America and much of Europe, and espoused that the strongest or the fittest should survive in society, while the weak and the unfit should be allowed to die. Again, we heard that before, but here it's taking shape again. with eugenics. This elitist theory that proposes that the might makes right was present in Western society long before Darwin's Origin of Species. However, Darwinian ideas were used to reinforce the elitist ideas and ideals. So the concept, all right, the concept of adoption was used to reinforce the claim that the rich and the powerful were better adapted to the social and economic climate of the time. And the concept of natural selection was used to propel the idea that it was natural, it was normal, and proper for the strong to thrive at the expense of the weak. So, social Darwinist, not only was survival for the fittest natural, it was also the morally correct thing to do. That's how the argument went. Many argue that it was morally right to assist, morally wrong to assist the weak, since that would be promoting the survival and reproduction of the less fit, and so following the science of Ernest Haeckel in 1854 through 1919. The right thing to do was to let the weak perish with their genetic imperfections and their illnesses. Tough love, right? Herbert Spencer, who lived up to 1903, coined the phrase the survival for the fittest in 1864 after reading Darwin's Origin of Species, of course. So Charles Darwin, who was a Lamarckian himself, called it natural selection or the preservation of the favored races in the struggle for life. Remember, Lamarck argued that the altered behavior of the organism led to a greater or lesser use of any given structure or organ, belonging to the organism rather. So Lamarck documented that all this in his book, Philosophies Zoologiques, in 1809. By the time of Darwin's Origin of Species, Lamarckianism had become one of the major scientific theories about degeneration. Now, I mentioned the term eugenics a few minutes ago. It's important to know that both the term and the movement was the brainchild of Francis Galton, living in 1822 through 1911, who was the cousin of Charles Darwin. These two, Darwin and Galton, shared a common grandfather by the name of Erasmus Darwin. And just like Darwin, Galton was born into a wealthy family. So the Galtons were highly successful gun manufacturers and bankers. And in 1883, 2 years before my grandfather was born in Kenya, Galton coined the term eugenics from the Greek word for well-born, and based the concept of the writings of on the writings of Charles Darwin. So Galton believed that the average Black person's intellectual standard was 2 grades below that of the Anglo-Saxon, and then also 2 grades below that of the residents of ancient Greece. According to Galton, Darwin's cousin, traits that were assumed to be inherited were character and personality, general intellectual ability, gregariousness, longevity, strong sexual passion, aversion to meat, craving for drink and gambling, and susceptibility to opium, proclivity to pauperism or poverty for that matter, and crimes of violence, or fraud and madness, and even tuberculosis. So those characteristics were assumed to be inheritable. So that if you were born poor, there was nothing you could do to improve yourself. If you were born in a family of mad people, there's nothing you could do to avoid being mad. Sounds like the classism of India, and the cravings for drink, or rather alcoholism, gambling, and crimes for violence. All this were inheritable traits, and there is nothing one could have done to avoid them. This thought played a big role in laying the groundwork for eugenics in the 1900s. So by the year 1888, the work of an Italian criminology We're gonna now start getting into government and criminology here, by the name of Cesare Lombroso. Cesare Lombroso claimed that criminals could be identified by their physical characteristics, including such features as a sloping forehead, if you have ears of unusual size, or a symmetry of the face, the cranium, or excessive arm length. All this had been introduced to American science. Lord have mercy. Where are we going with this? An agenda was brewing here, and the history of the next 100 years will be influenced by these thoughts and by this myth of race. Now, think of the trouble that lies ahead for the African Americans in the New World. Their stereotypes will be applied to them as a community, and there will be a lot of suffering for the African Americans in the years to come because of this myth brewing up in the 17th, in the 16th, 7th, and 18th, 19th centuries. But here's the caveat. You ready for this? In 1891, in his presidential address to the American Anthropological Society in Washington, a gentleman by the name of Robert Fletcher explained that the influence of heredity on criminal character was admitted and accounted for 50 to 70% of 75% in actuality of criminal behavior. Nearly every case of criminal behavior beginning in 1891 could be explained by ancestral influence. Good seeds generate sound and healthy fruit. Logical, right? Imperfect percentage can only yield defective offspring. Well, the science, or rather, should I say, the myth argued that. And so in 1907, this is where it gets worse. 1907. Now, this mess is going to go national and to have devastating effects on families living in the United States and in Europe. In 1907, American president by the name of Woodrow Wilson. Did you know about him? Woodrow Wilson, who supported the science of eugenics and the efforts of eugenics, helped the state of Indiana to adopt legislation making the sterilization of certain undesirable individuals compulsory. If we do not like you, we sterilize you because you are unfit, right, to live. You are going to breed only other unfit people. And in less than maybe 20 years from this date, from the 1900s, more than 30 states in America had adopted such inhuman laws. And it all started as a myth. And now it's going to the criminal justice and to the sterilization of humans who are caught up in crime. And remember, sometimes all it needed to take was an accusation, and you are in for trouble. So beginning with the state of Connecticut in 1896, anyone who was epileptic, imbecile, or basically unable to reason well, or stupid for that matter, anyone who was feeble-minded was prevented from marrying. Cannot be allowed to breed stupidity. No, 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 no. Classism is beginning to shape up in the Americas, all again because of the myth of race. A new name is coming up now, and the name is that of Charles Davenport, who received his Ph.D. at Harvard University and taught at Harvard University and the University of Chicago. Now, he becomes the leading proponent of American eugenics. Well, we have moved from the 13th, 14th to the 18th centuries and now to the 19th centuries, and I've seen how a myth can cause such great havoc to human life and existence. We have looked at how the church got involved in the 1700s and how it attempted to intervene, but later got compromised. We have looked at the philosophies of David Hume, Haggle, John Rousseau, American Immanuel Kant, and how also it influenced the myth of race. We have looked at the sciences and anthropology and zoology and paleontology and embryologies and the genetics and how decisions regarding life were made in the absence of proper scientific data. We have looked into the theories of evolution and the political class and the wealthy. We have looked into their history and the political class from Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and now Woodrow Wilson, and their involvement in the propagation of the myth of race and eugenics. We have looked at the impact of education, especially the influence of Harvard University, Oxford University, and I think Yale is going to come in pretty soon here. And the history is not that good. Now, we are looking at the influence of politics from the 1900s, and I'm afraid it's not going to be looking good either. The wounds are still deep, and the memories for some are still fresh and deep. All this leads us to cry like Prophet Isaiah. Lord have mercy. I am ruined and I live amongst the people of unclean lips. I am ruined. Or maybe you cry like Apostle Paul. Oh, what a wretched person I am. What a wretched people we are. Lord have mercy on us. Let's stop here for now and continue with the history of Davenport during our next episode. And how did we get here? This has been Can You Believe It? And our responsibility here really is to dig deep and scoop the fine sand from the pressures of the waters above us. Scoop that fine sand, bring it up to the top for inspection. And after we discover the truth, openly share it to all creatures, big and small, on God's green earth. This is Can You Believe It? Join us next time. Thank you.